All right, welcome everybody. Hello and welcome to the last virtual tasting of 2020. Here we are, December 18th. We've made it.
You said the last virtual tasting, and I was sure that that could not be true, but then you said of 2020, so I'm now caught up again.
Yes, we will. We'll be in touch. We're trying to figure out what comes next. It might not look exactly like this, but we'll figure out some way to be in touch with people because I think the current state of things will last a little bit longer, but we're delighted to have you here. I know I looked at the registration list and I think there's some new names and faces, so that's kind of exciting. It's we're really excited about this topic too, so I think it's a great way to round out the year. Of course, if you're new, just a couple quick housekeeping notes at the bottom. I feel like now in 2020, everyone knows how Zoom works, but at the bottom, you've got a chat and a Q&A. If it's your first time joining us, the chat is always a lot of fun, so get in there and let us know where you're drinking from. You're not calling, I guess. You're where you are and what you're drinking.
Angela Douglas is over here
only
across the table from us chatting with you.
Yes. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A there, and we'll try and get to some of those at the end. So today's, well, and I guess I should say, if it is your first time, I'm Megan Carter, and this is Mike Hendry. Today, our topic was really, I think, inspired by the questions we get most after, last month's session, which was all about, aroma and evaluating wine. We get that question a lot. What does this wine smell like? What does it taste like? The next question is, what should I eat with it? Or, the reverse, which is, I'm making such and such tonight. What wine should I have with it? So we thought it would be fun to dive into it. Like many of our other virtual tastings so far, I would say it's a pretty messy, complex topic.
And I think this one's a little different. I think with with all of our topics, we've tried to have some sort of core of interesting factual pieces that we can work around and use to describe this topic.
Right.
But this is by far the most subjective of our topics, but I think it might also be one of the most important. I think we all agree that this is sort of what it's all about. The reason we enjoy wine is these moments that we've had at meals that are incredible, and they're memories that can last for decades, maybe forever. So this is sort of the thing we pursue, but it's maybe the hardest to find and definitely one of the hardest to quantify. And we tried really hard to include statistics in this one, but we were unable to.
Sorry to disappoint.
Yeah, we're going to try to talk about some of the basics and maybe some things that we can all agree on. We're going to sort of talk about some things that we can argue over, probably.
Right. Yeah, I mean, as Mike said, we looked for statistics, but we actually, we did some research and, consulted a lot of different writers and wine experts, food writers, that kind of thing. And one thing we noticed is that there are a lot of different opinions out there. They don't always agree with each other. So, and
sometimes they're completely opposed. I mean, there's a lot of writing on this topic. There are books about this topic. There are, and we didn't, before each of these tastings, we tend to, we start with our own opinions, but we also pull a bunch of things off the shelf and we try to see what other people say. And this is one that there's a lot of disagreement over. I think there are some ways to simplify it. There are things that most people can agree on. But I think toward the end of this, we'll get through this, and we're just going to talk about things that we've had with wine and some favorite pairings with each of our Hendry wines.
Yeah. So I think we thought we'd start with sort of just some principles, things that despite the varying opinions and everything we've read, seem to kind of rise to the top as a couple of principles that I think we could sort of probably all agree on. The first, of course, being that we might disagree around the details and, which wine pairs best with which dish, but I think we can all agree that at its core, food impacts wine and vice versa.
Right. And what you're eating can shift the way your wine tastes and vice versa. And sometimes it can shift it in a positive direction and sometimes it shifts it in a negative direction.
Right. And I think anyone who's had a glass of orange juice right after brushing your teeth knows that it tastes terrible, though you may have loved the orange juice at breakfast 30 minutes before. So, the orange juice didn't change, you did because you put something else on your mouth. So we will kind of talk about some of those principles, and then we thought we would get into some specifics around specific elements of food and taste. And then we've got this little board here where we thought we could do some experiments. And I apologize to anyone who signed up, late yesterday or early today. You may not have received this email, but it's something you can do on your own at home, now or later. But we've got a board here with things that are sweet and salty and spicy and hot and bitter. And we thought we would sort of try them with the various wines that we have and kind of see how they taste. And then, as Mike said, we're just going to like open it up and talk about food and wine dishes that we've just loved.
Yeah, it's definitely not every day that a cupcake, a jalapeno, and a mushroom wind up on the same board
Yes,
together.
Hot sauce, chocolate,
Yeah.
gouda, endive.
Yeah.
It's an eclectic mix.
So what we're trying to do here, and we'll work through it, but we're trying to look at we're going to try to break food and wine down into some basic elements and look at how those affect things.
Right. Yeah. But if we want to start with sort of the principles of food and wine pairing, I think there were sort of 2 or 3 things that really sort of floated to the top in all of the reading. And one is that you kind of want to match the intensity of the food and the wine. Whether if you've got a really bold wine, having a bold dish to go with it, or a delicate wine and a delicate dish. I think you can also think about matching other elements like the texture of the wine. There was one book I read, thought it was so interesting, where they talked about the volume and the texture of food, and that was sort of a fun way to think about it. But, if it's a really, if you've got this big, bold tannic wine, there's a lot of body there, are you pairing that with a dish that feels, super, super light? That might feel kind of out of whack. And you can match aromas too, right?
Right. Yeah. And this is something that comes up a lot too, is sometimes when we think about, I think we all agree, as you were saying, that more delicate wines are best paired with more delicate foods. More strongly flavored, sort of intense wines are better paired with strongly flavored and intense foods. But when it comes to aromas, sometimes we will associate certain wines that may have distinct smells, whether they're herbaceous or sort of fruity smells. We often, think of matching food and wine with similar smells. But sometimes it's also interesting to have contrasting sort of flavors. Yeah. And those both have a role at different times. So.
Yeah, which I think sort of leads into the second principle that we found, which was the idea of deciding when you're pairing food and wine, do you want to have a pairing that mirrors one another, where the food and the wine, look sort of similar, or do you want to have a contrasting pairing, and everyone kind of seemed to have a different way of putting this idea. We talked about the idea of parallel versus perpendicular. We heard
that's
all
the one I
things.
liked.
Yeah, but whatever you want to call it, are you trying to match similarities within the wine? Or are you trying to like mix it up a little bit? So, I think one example we read about was a creamy mac and cheese, which is by chance one of my favorite foods, and I think would taste fantastic with this barrel fermented Chardonnay. Kind of the creamy texture in the wine matches the creaminess in the food. They're both sort of rich things, but I think it could also be really fantastic with a sparkling wine, a champagne, something with a lot of really nice acidity to cut through all that fat and creaminess. So, it sort of depends, I guess. I think both could be great pairings. So there isn't really a wrong or a right answer, but trying to decide for yourself, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to maybe enhance and kind of mirror some of those flavors and images or aromas and textures, or contrast them?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times a dish in and of itself has a lot of different textures and aromas and elements, right? It's very rare that you're just eating something that is just spicy, for instance, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if we were eating at a restaurant with a 6-course wine and food pairing menu, it's one thing, but most of us normal humans sit down with a variety of dishes and open a single bottle of food or a single bottle of wine for dinner. And so you're often striving for some sort of average instead of making a perfect pairing every time too. Yeah. So you've got a variety with on your table, and within a dish, you've got quite a mix of foods. And we talk about pairings that we like the best, but there's often more going on in the meal than that. So. Yeah,
and I think that's one reason people always wonder about Thanksgiving and what to do with that table. You've got turkey and stuffing and potatoes and a tart cranberry sauce, and there are lots of options there. And
sometimes the solution is just to open lots of bottles of wine.
Yeah, we've been known to do that too.
Yeah.
So, and I think, you know, sometimes this topic can feel fairly overwhelming, but to me, and one of the reasons we thought we would break down this idea in terms of, you know, elements of food and taste is that, you know, we all want to have the best, you know, a fantastic pairing. We want the pairing where the wine's going to make the food taste fantastic. The food will make the wine, you know, really shine. But I think a lot of the times for me, it's just about making sure that you aren't ruining one of them, you know, one aspect of the meal, that you're not creating a terrible pairing.
That sounds like setting your sights low, but I agree.
Yes,
actually,
yeah. I mean, and I think we'll start going through some of these elements, and I think the idea is, you know, when you think about them, you can sort of also then figure out how to adjust if you have accidentally wandered into a terrible pairing, which again, we've all kind of done.
Yeah.
So, all right, we're going to do some screen sharing here. It's and we have a whole presentation. We took our cue from Mike's brother last time around. So here we go. So I've got here a couple of key elements that you find in both food and wine: salt, fat, acid, heat, sugar, bitter, and umami. And the one with stars there, those are things that, you know, are elements that you find in both food and wine. You know, we know that wine has lots of different types of acid, actually. Even though we don't always taste it, you know, there's often some sugar that's gone into wine. And in the case of wine, I think bitter is sort of best thought about as tannin and the effect that tannin has on our palate.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, tannins have a couple of functions. One is this sort of drying effect on the inside of your mouth, but they are also inherently bitter.
Yeah.
So yes, both of those things.
Yeah. So we thought we'd start with salt here.
Yeah. And I think some of these in that list, you know, salt and acid and bitterness are the things that are sort of easiest for me to think about. There are some that are a little more complicated, like umami, that we'll talk about, but salt is one of the ones we all know what salt tastes like. And so more or less salt in food is definitely one of the ones that everybody agrees has an influence on the wine. And,
yeah.
and you know, I think this is also what you see in this chart here is fairly widely agreed upon. If you, as food gets a little saltier, it tends to decrease the acidity and the bitterness in the wine. And it tends to make the wine feel sort of richer and fuller.
Right. And I think the way to sort of interpret this very basic graphic, you know, we aren't graphic designers over here. But this is about the perception, right? You know, salt doesn't actually, if you have a salty dish, it's not going to actually decrease the acidity in the food, right?
Right.
In the wine, it decreases our perception of it.
Yeah.
So if you've got a little tasting board at home, you know, we thought what's the easiest, most basic way to represent salt. And it's actually with some salt here. So you can try, if you like, you know, to take one of these wines, the Barrel Fermented Chardonnay or the Zinfandel, you know, have a couple sips, see what you think, and then take a little bit of salt and see if it changes.
And we can also try some of these things in combination a little bit later too. But yeah, I'm going to give that a try. I'll put a little salt on my hand here.
Yep, it's the old tequila method here.
Mm-hmm. We did have a debate as to whether or not we'd be
salty
spitting or not. And since it was the last tasting of 2020, I think we generally agreed that we didn't need spit buckets, but we'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
but I do think so. So to me, that sort of it strikes me. I mean, I feel like it makes the fruit come forward in the wine a little bit more, and it does make the wine. You know, it increases the perception of the richness.
I was going to say the creaminess to me is the biggest, more than the fruitiness perhaps, but it's already a fairly creamy wine. But that was the first thing I noticed on that second sip, is it felt even richer.
Yeah. Okay.
So, yeah. And we should also note too, you know, if you guys are doing this at home, we also know that many of you are big food and wine fans and email us all the time with fun, you know, recipes you've tried at home. So if you have some ideas or, you know, pairings that you've loved or something like that, or observations, please add it to the chat, because I think, you know, we are not.
We're well aware that the depth of food and wine pairing knowledge on the other side of the screen here is at least as big as ours. You know, we have some things to share, but we'd love to hear what you think too.
Yeah. So the next element we thought we'd go through is fat. And if any of you have done George's seminar, you know he loves to talk about fat and tannin. So in this case, sort of the bitterness. But it does some other things as well, you know, in addition to sort of decreasing the perception of bitterness, it can really kind of enhance the acidity and the fruitiness of the wine.
Yeah, and fat to me, I often think where I start with fat in food is its influence on tannin, and that does it I think also sort of plays through with the bitterness, but it certainly reduces the effect of bitterness. And that I think sort of inherently, it reduces the effect of the drying effect of the tannin. And that does tend to make it seem more fruity.
Yeah. And to me, you know, there are a couple of different ways to think about it, but to me, when the sort of effect of the tannin gets minimized, then it just allows, you know, creates sort of space, if you will, like on your palate for all these other elements that were there to begin with to kind of shine.
Yeah.
So we've got some crackers here and some olive oil. I'm going to try this, I think, with the Zinfandel, because that's where we've got more tannin here than in the Cabernet.
And
Chardonnay.
What's interesting to me is and what we typically do here is we sort of take a bite of food and then we try the wine. But I find with fat too, one of the biggest effects for me comes from trying the wine and then trying the olive oil. It can have an interesting effect afterward that's a little different from the effect before. So maybe try it both ways if you want.
Right. I think when you try the wine before and then, you know, introduce something else and then try it again, I think you get to see the difference a little bit better.
Yeah.
We've got the olive oil. We also have some gouda here. I don't know if people have picked other cheese. We got, you know, nice fatty aged gouda or cheddar.
Yeah.
Which I'm realizing is very close to the jalapeno on my side of the board here. So I think I'm getting a little bit of that as well.
It's making me hungry.
Yeah.
I think they, you know, both of these wines, you do feel the effect of the oil in this case. It definitely shifts both of the wines.
Yeah. And again, I think to me, in this case, there was an impact on the tannin, but also that fruitiness kind of jumped up.
Jumped a little bit.
Yeah. Personally, I didn't notice a huge change in the acidity as much, but definitely the fruitiness.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I think next we've got acid. And this, I will say, was one of the first food pairing kind of aha moments that I had when I first got into wine. When I was taking one of the WSET courses, we had to have a sip of Sauvignon Blanc, you know, known to be a rather acidic wine. If you have our Albarino, I think this little experiment would work with that. Had a sip, you know, your mouth waters, you kind of notice the, oh, look at that, we've got
some Albarino.
You know, your mouth kind of waters from all of that acidity. And then we all had to take a lemon, a slice of lemon, suck on the lemon, and take another sip of the, in this case, Albarino. And it really, I think, to me, back then, I realized I felt like I was tasting water. You know, my palate had become so accustomed from that lemon, which has such high acidity, to you know, this particular amount that even a fairly acidic wine couldn't really match that. So I think that's another point about all of this is, you know, it's not simply acid in the food, but it's about how much there is, right? And
Yeah.
you're trying to find a level of balance. You know, there are certainly less acidic things than a lemon that we could have had with that Sauvignon Blanc. But throwing your palate completely out of whack in one way really is going to have an impact on the food, on the wine. Does it make a difference
and
to you?
I think that like for me, we have a bunch of things to talk about here, and we will. But to me, the two elements, and what we're trying to do here is we're trying to break down food into some of its basic elements in terms of taste. But acid and sweetness are the two for me that have the most dramatic effects on wine. And a little acidity can have a huge effect on sort of softening the acid of a wine and really softening the wine. And softening a wine isn't always better. I think we started this, we talked about this at the start. You don't want to overpower the wine and make it a very light and watery thing. So again, sort of understanding your wine and the acid and salt and fat balance in your food to get to a point that works with the wine. And that's, I mean, we use balance with grapevines. We use balance with wine. We use it with food. It's one of these sort of vague terms that's actually quite important. We all sort of get the general meaning of the term, but it's hard to put a number on.
Yeah. Well, partly because we're also so different. You know, everyone's tolerance for things like acid or sugar is going to be different. So,
right.
Did that all bring no taste less acidic?
Absolutely. It's a very dramatic. I mean, it's much. So we're showing some of the shifts in wine that are the same here. We're showing some of the same stuff with the salt, but for me, it's very dramatic here in terms of the acidity.
Yeah. Well, as you said, I think acid and sugar in particular can be have quite an impact.
Yeah.
So speaking of sugar, I think this one comes up a lot, mostly in the context of, do I serve a dessert wine, or if we want to keep drinking through the dessert course, what do we do? And it can be tricky, if you have, in the same way, if you have, a lemon and then you pair it with a Sauvignon Blanc, it's going to make the Sauvignon Blanc seem far less acidic. If you have a super, super sweet dessert and then you pair it with a wine where the sugar levels aren't quite the same, it's going to make that taste flat. Or sometimes I think about chocolate cake, could make it taste a little bitter almost, because it's decreasing the sugar and you're noticing all of these other things with it.
Right. But I mean, I think this goes beyond dessert. I mean, we actually eat a lot of things that are quite sweet, sweet
True.
Potatoes. There are a lot of other vegetables, a lot of the squash that are, they're delicious right now, but they're actually quite sweet. And sweetness can really be hard on wine. Mm-hmm. They're one of the things that pops up in a lot of these food and wine pairing books, especially when it comes to dessert, is that, you want to make sure that your wine is sweeter than your dessert. But as most of you have heard George mention, all of the wines that we bottle here are dry. We don't compete well when it comes to sweetness in food. So it's very, and this is, I've done a lot of wine dinners in various places, and, we don't have a true dessert wine to pair with these desserts. So I've seen higher and lower levels of success with pairing Hendry wines with desserts, and it can be done very well. Yeah. And one of the examples, many of you have been here for our wine club parties, and the way that Oak Street pairs that chocolate tort with flourless chocolate cake with the Primitivo works very well.
Right.
More sweeter desserts are very tough on the wine.
Yeah. And I hadn't really thought about that, why that is or how I would characterize it until we started diving into this. But I think that's a good example of where a contrasting pairing, rather than trying to mirror it, really kind of works better.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just tried this insanely sweet grocery store cupcake, which I got to say, when I was a kid, I really coveted these, and my mom wouldn't buy them, and I thought it was terrible. But now I understand why. And the bitterness in that Chardonnay really, really jumped out at me.
I'm going to do this too. I didn't want to, but I will. Although I do like these, just not with wine.
No, yes, with coffee.
Mm.
Yeah. But yeah, I think sugar, it can be a really tricky thing, and especially when it comes to dessert. But again, if you guys have some fun ideas, this is where I would prefer it pretty tart, right?
Yeah, no,
Tart,
especially with the acid and sugar, the effects on the wine are the most dramatic to me.
Yeah, yeah.
That doesn't taste good.
No. So we'll skip right over that. But yeah, if you guys have ideas of, dessert pairings that you like, I usually just would rather, have another wine and then, pair some cheese or something with it instead. But there are ways to do it. But this, I think, is one of the biggest sort of stumbling blocks. So then we wanted to move into some elements in food and wine where, what we found both in our own experience and what we were reading was a little vaguer.
Yeah.
So,
and umami comes up a lot. It's not something that I have as clear a picture of as I do like salt and sweetness and sourness. But, umami is this yummy sensation that can come from mushrooms. It can come from
like Parmesan,
yeah.
That's a very salty thing, but it also has a lot of umami. Parmesan, prosciutto.
And I'm forgetting the name. You see it in Japanese food a lot. Those dried fish flakes have a lot of that. And we saw very conflicting
opinions.
We saw very conflicting opinions on how umami affects wine. And in some of the books we looked at, people suggested that it shifts wine in the same direction that sweetness does. So things that are higher in umami can tend to make the wine taste more sour and decrease the fruit and increase the bitterness.
I'm going to try this with, we've got little cooked mushrooms here. Try this with the Zinfandel. Yeah, and then, some other writers, one that I read, talked about how it can really boost flavor and enhance things and kind of just, as Emerald would say, like kick it up a notch, So they used the example of a cab and a really great steak. And they said if you throw all these cooked mushrooms on top, it's really just going to make that pairing even better. But that's a very different opinion than some of the other stuff we saw. So.
Yeah, I think with the Zinfandel here, to me, it does make the wine a little harder, a little more acidic. But it's not as dramatic as it is with the sugar. So yeah, we'd be interested to know what you guys think, but.
Yeah, I think it's more acidic.
Yeah.
The fruit, I think, is still there though. Yeah. So we'd be curious to know, if this is one that some of you have played around with a little bit more. And then the other two elements are bitterness in food and heat or spice in food. And these were ones where we thought it's really hard to think of examples where it makes the wine better.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I couldn't think of any. When it comes to heat, I don't feel like I've ever tasted something spicy that's made the wine better. I think there are some wines that can tolerate it and sort of hang in there, but I don't feel like it's enhanced the wine in any way. And also with bitter, I think we've sort of, what we've been presenting is this idea is that when you're eating a food that's sweeter, it tends to make the wine less sweet. You would think that then that would hold true with bitterness too. And if you were tasting something bitter, it might make the wine taste less bitter. But I feel like when I'm eating something bitter, that bitterness just tends to linger for me in the wine as well. I also brought this up with Tamara, who many of you know, and she mentioned that she immediately came up with an example that was contrary to that. And apparently in Bordeaux, they like to serve fresh walnuts with their wine sometime. And the bitterness in the walnuts can apparently reduce the bitterness in the wine. So we didn't think far enough ahead to have some fresh walnuts here, but it would be interesting to sort of try that and see what happens.
Yeah. And in terms of the hot and spicy foods, I think, again, it's hard to find examples where they enhance the wine, but I think it's important to sort of recognize the role that they have and how they do impact the wine, because again, this is where you get into trouble, and I think about really spicy curries or something like that. And then you order this big tannic cab with, 16% alcohol or something, and your mouth feels like it's on fire.
Yeah.
So this is actually an instance where I would actually have a sweet wine. You know, the sugar tends to kind of counteract the heat. So, you know, again, it kind of influences my choice around the wine I'm going to order in order to avoid a bad pairing. But, you know, I probably am not going to be in a situation where I think this wine is really great. What spicy thing can I serve with it that's going to make it even better?
I feel like wine just sort of amplifies the heat sometimes. And I'm not, I mean, I like spicy food sometimes. I'm not I'm not out there on the extreme end of spicy stuff, but I like it. I just don't like it so much with wine.
Yeah. So this is where we thought maybe beer.
Yeah. Sometimes beer is perfect. and there are, you know, there are a lot of IPAs that are extremely bitter, right? I mean, these things, if you're going to have something that goes with bitter food, then that beer would have to be it.
Yeah.
I just tried this endive. We have an endive here as sort of a bitter example. And I tried that. I tried it with this Zinfandel, and the bitterness just seemed to persist in the wine for me. I wound up with more bitterness in the wine than I would have had otherwise. So I don't, you know, to me, it's not affecting the wine the way we do with, you know, the clear cut sort of shift that you see with the sugar and acid. I'm also going to try some of this very dark chocolate.
Yeah.
Which we'll see.
Yeah, this is, I think, 90% cocoa. So it's, you know, it's not a lot of milk in there. It's not a lot of sugar.
And some people absolutely love chocolate with wine.
Yep.
I've never gotten to that point myself. I mean, I sort of like it, but again, I mean, maybe I need to sit down with somebody who is good at chocolate and wine and go through something.
Yeah. Well, and as we've learned here too, and I think we talked about this last month, you know, the PTC test that you can do, and we've got some of these, you know, little paper strips here at the winery, and some of our longtime club members have experienced this test. Is the little piece of paper that has a compound, and some people put it on their mouth and it's super bitter and they have to spit it out right away. Other people think, you know, gee whiz, why do I have this piece of paper on my tongue? So and again, this is subjective, you know, our own preferences and palates and tolerance levels for some of these things can be really different, you know. So you probably saw me make a face when I eat this endive. I don't particularly like bitter things, and it continued to be there in my mouth when I had the wine. It was there afterwards. The wine didn't wash it away. It was still there, and I don't particularly care for that. But someone else might just love like a good endive salad or something like that.
I do like endive salads.
No, okay,
I don't.
There you go.
I just don't think they make the wine better.
That's true. Yeah. So this is where you have a beer.
Yeah. But I also tried. So here with the dark chocolate, we have a couple squares of Hershey's, and that didn't work out very well with the Zinfandel either.
No, too sweet.
Yeah, very sweet.
Very sweet. Yeah. So, you know, again, all of this, it seems like a lot of information. This is sort of a summary of it. You know, people tend to use, I think Mike's been throwing out the word harder. You know, softer would be, of course, the opposite of that. But really, when we think about, you know, the effects it has, and you know, it's again a little subjective, but when we talk about a wine, you know, becoming harder because of the food choices, it's, you know, generally becoming more tannic, feels drier, it's increasing the perception of bitterness and acidity, becomes less sweet, less fruity, and then softer is, of course, the opposite. So the fruit really sings and shines. You don't notice the tannin as much. You don't notice the acid as much. But again, you know, one thing we realized when thinking about this is, you know, well, do you necessarily want to make the wine softer or harder? You know, what's the wine like to start?
Yeah. And whatever combination you find, you want something that's going to still sort of preserve the nuances in the wine.
Right.
So, and I'm going to try here now sort of two of the things in combination. So I'm going to put a little salt on the lemon and try that, and then I'm going to try the wine again. So
I think I'm going to try, we have some hot sauce here. I'm going to try that with, now I've got spicy cheese. I've just spilled everywhere. I've made my own pepper jack, but try this with the Zinfandel and see what the heat does with the tannin.
The Chardonnay, it tastes actually really good. It seems to me to enhance the. Now, I guess this is obvious, but there's a lot of, really enhance the citrus character in the Chardonnay in that case, but also, the wine tasted pretty good in that case.
That's good. Yeah. So yeah, a lot of this too happens in combination.
So we're also, we've been talking about sort of flavor components and mm-hmm. sensations in your mouth, but aromas are also another important one. Right. And I'd mentioned at the start that, when we're thinking of food and wine pairings, we're often thinking of elements in food that are similar to elements in wine and put those together. But we all, and an important thing to remember about that, we all, I think, have had this experience of doing something like cooking fish in the house and enjoying that, and then leaving for a while and coming back and realizing that your house smells overwhelmingly fishy, and you weren't aware of that
as you were
cooking or eating. And this happens with wine too. If you have an element in food that is very, and this, an easy example to do this would be a very sort of green herbaceous Sauvignon Blanc again. I feel like we're picking on Sauvignon Blanc, but imagine you had a very herbaceous Sauvignon Blanc, and then you took a bite of a green pepper, and then went back to the Sauvignon Blanc and maybe went back and forth for a time. What you would find is that the herbaceous notes in the Sauvignon Blanc are greatly reduced. So what then starts to come out of the wine more is a little more of the fruit, some more of the peachy kind of characters, and that's a very interesting sort of suppression of some things in the wine that can make the wine, not necessarily better. I also enjoy some of these herbaceous qualities in wines. I don't think we want everything to taste like, raspberry jam. I think this is one of the things that make wines like Pinot Noir and Cabernet such great wines, is that they can have such a broad range of aromas and flavors that include herbaceous things and earthy things and some mushroomy things and things that we enjoy with food. But when it comes to aromas, it's a little bit different. So you have, again, it's aromas in the food shifting the aromas in the wine, perhaps.
Right. And when you start to think about that, and then you consider all the different elements that you have in the meal that you're serving, and how complex something like a Pinot Noir or a Cabernet can be, you suddenly realize you're like, well, how am I ever supposed to pick? Yeah. I think that's why this is such a perplexing topic for so many people, myself included a lot of the time. And, but also, just kind of fun. I think you just really kind of have to try a lot of things and sort of see what works for you. But, so yeah, we hope that you guys had some fun with this little setup, and you can continue the experiments at home.
Unfortunately, a lot of this is about making wine taste bad in certain circumstances, but right. It's the goal with the food pairings is to find some harmony. But what we're looking at and talking about is the way that different foods can shift your wine for better or worse.
And understanding what those potential potholes are, I think, can be really great. So if you're preparing a curry, maybe go pick a Riesling that night for dinner rather than a cab or something. So, but now we thought we would shift gears and just talk about some of the favorite things we've had to drink and eat over the years together. And specifically with Hendry wines.
And this is fun. We made a list, and I've got some.
Mike pilfered his cookbook collection.
I've got some props too. Yeah.
I'd love to hear your ideas too, so we can share some at the end, or you can follow along in the chat, things that you've loved.
So I'm going to start with Albarino, and in the first two wines we're going to look at here, it's sort of the order we might taste them here at the winery, but Albarino and unoaked Chardonnay. And one of the things that I have sort of decided I like about wines in this style is that I like to pair with a wine where the objective is sort of the fresh fruit. I like to pair freshness with freshness. Mm-hmm. And when we talk about things that are fresh, it could be fresh fruit or it could be fresh seafood. But that freshness to freshness works well for me. And one of the most enjoyable glasses of wine I've had was sitting in a beautiful spot in Rhode Island, a mix of both sort of raw clams and steamed clams at a place that sold our Albarino, and it was the perfect pairing to me. That Albarino is good with all kinds of seafood, but it has not been better than that for me.
Yeah, mine is also a seafood dish, and I will say I feel at a real disadvantage here compared to Mike, because so many of my great culinary moments have happened thanks to Mike. So, but one dish that I feel pleased to have added maybe to your repertoire are these fish tacos that my friend's husband down in Santa Barbara makes. And I feel like I've actually talked about them on one of the virtual tastings before. But, just a simple white fish marinated in vinegar and olive oil, a little dill and mustard. And that's really tasty. And then you sort of grill it all up, and that plus some like slaw and crema or something like that in the Albarino is really great.
Geez, they are really great.
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah.
One of my shining dishes. There are only a couple, but that's one of them. What about unoaked Chardonnay?
So with the unoaked Chardonnay, I'm going to go to this pasta book, and I only started making pasta a couple of years ago, and it's always seemed like this impossibly complicated thing.
Yeah.
And it turns out it's really pretty easy once you kind of get the hang. And I think there are harder and easier ways to do it, but it's not that the very elaborate noodle shapes and things. I don't do that, but I can, roll it out and make, sort of the flat stuff and things like linguine. So there's a recipe in here that is absolutely amazing with the unoaked Chardonnay, and it's lemon farfalle with spring pea ragu. So in the pasta dough, there's a lot of lemon zest and some parsley, and then these very fresh spring vegetables with, again, more lemon zest and lemon juice and some cheese, and it's great with the unoaked Chardonnay.
Yeah, mine is sort of similar, a pasta dish.
It looks like this.
That looks pretty refreshing. Yeah.
They want to see the book.
Oh, this one. Flour and Water, it's called. And it goes into all sorts of complicated, ways to make pasta, but there's a lot of the basics and some really delicious stuff in there.
Yeah. My mom is really partial to a lemony shrimp pasta. That also it goes with your idea of pairing fresh and fresh. It's a lot of fresh flavors. The unoaked Chardonnay is, I think, not quite as acidic as that Albarino, so I think it kind of goes nicely with that. With the shrimp, which feels like slightly richer, but you have a lot of fresh herbs and lemon and good like brothiness to it. I think that's really good.
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
Yeah. What about barrel fermented?
So for barrel fermented chard, and I've got another cookbook here, but Terra was, it's not around anymore, but it was such a great restaurant.
Here in Napa.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it was in St. Helena.
The valley, yeah.
So, some of my favorite fine dining meals were there, but one of their one of their signature dishes was this Chilean sea bass, and it's in a broth with these dumplings that are a mix of shrimp and scallop. It's the sake marinated sea bass in this broth with some mushrooms and carrots and just a fantastic dish. And it turns out it's not that hard to make, and you have to think ahead a little bit and marinate it, but it's not that difficult. So I've made it a couple times now, and I think it's nearly perfect with the Chardonnay. Looks like that, and it's that Chilean sea bass is such a rich fish that it complements the richness in the barrel fermented Chardonnay really nicely. I will also say I'm sort of a seafood. I care about where it comes from, and Chilean sea bass has had its ups and downs. They actually, at Terra, they switched from that to a black cod for a time. And I believe that the Chilean sea bass, what I consult is the Monterey Bay Seafood Watch sort of recommendation list. And there is now a better process for that fishery. So I'm back to Chilean sea bass in small quantities.
I also the barrel fermented Chardonnay is one of my favorite wines. There's so, because I think it is so versatile. You know, I love it with just a simple roast chicken. I think that can be really, really lovely. But I also really love it with scallops. And if you've ever come to one of our wine club luncheons, you know, there have been a couple of years where we've had scallops in a beurre blanc that Oak Avenue Catering did. And I don't even like scallops.
Well, I do.
And I was like, are there seconds? It was so good. And I think it was the creaminess, right? And that was, I guess, a good example of a mirroring kind of pairing. And I loved it.
Yeah.
Did not think I would.
That's amazing.
That's a really good one. Yeah.
And I think a lot of you have had that as well.
Yeah.
So.
Makes a scallop lover out of anyone.
Yes.
What about Pinot? So
Pinot, I don't cook a lot of duck, but I've had, and this happens a lot with wine dinners, and I think it's perfect. It's the Pinot Noir, and sometimes the duck has a little sort of sauce that's fruit based, something with, you know, dried sour cherries, something if there's something, you know, mushroomy. But you know, duck breast with the Pinot is one of my favorites.
Yeah. The mushroom is sort of what I often go to when I'm pairing Pinot. And there was a recipe earlier this year in the New York Times cooking section by Clancy Miller for this mushroom Parmesan tart that was fantastic. And the great thing about it is I'm a very, sometimes get a little lazy around the cooking, and you know, it was something you could prepare in advance, and then you like pulled it out and it looked fantastic at dinner, which I enjoy the show, but you know, you can still then enjoy your appetizers with your guests. So yeah, the mushroom tart by Clancy Miller in the New York Times, that and the Pinot was really fantastic.
Awesome.
Yeah. Let's see, Primitivo would be the next one that we would taste.
So I'm gonna go. I like the Primitivo is not a dessert wine, and it should not be limited to that. But I do love the way that it tastes with that flourless chocolate cake at the, you know, the dessert that often happens with our wine club lunches.
Oh, and I would have it at the very beginning of the meal with maybe a charcuterie plate. So, you know, maybe slightly chilled even, you know, but I think the Primitivo is so wonderfully fruity that I guess it kind of contrasts with like the fat and the salt and the, you know, in the meat. So I like that's where I would have it. So you could open a bottle and start and end your meal with it.
Great. It's actually burger night tonight.
It is.
You know, so I am getting hungry, but it's not going to be this fancy. We have Molly's dad's cousin is now raising beef, so we have a half a cow to get through, and it's burger night once a week. So that's tonight. Yeah. 7 and 22.
Yeah, the Zinfandels.
So with that, I sort of an herb crusted pork tenderloin to me is nearly perfect. I think, you know, we talked about salt and sweet, but the broad category of herbs, I think very herby foods can really enhance the fruit in the wine as well. And that combination of the Zin and a herby pork tenderloin is really, really good.
Yeah. I actually like it with a chili, you know, provided that, again, as we sort of discussed earlier, that it's not too hot and spicy, but, you know, a good beef or even like a turkey chili or something, I think can be really nice because there's just so much flavor in it. And I think that's one thing that to me with the Zinfandel kind of stands out. And it's, you know, the Zin has a lot of, you know, fruitiness, but also kind of a nice peppery spice note. And so I want something just as kind of bold to match that. So I like it with a chili.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. Would you do something different with the Block 28?
So there are two meals that very memorable meals I've had with Block 28 that stick out in my mind. And one was a beef short rib meal where they cooked it with star anise in there. And there are times when the Block 28 really has that sort of anise quality to me. And that was amazing. And another meal, that was venison with a morel mushroom sauce that was perfect with the Block 28.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I think that would be good. I just love a tri-tip. You know, it's not quite as fatty as some other cuts of meat. So if I'm going to have, you know, a big cab or something, I'd probably go with a big old, you know, ribeye or something like that. But the tri-tip with, I think, Zinfandel is just a classic. Feels also very classically Californian. Mm-hmm. So you can eat that and pretend you're in Napa Valley. What about the red blend?
So now I have family members who are raising beef, but I also have family members who are raising lambs. So Molly's dad is raising lambs, and they're absolutely delicious. His Bear Track Farm is his farm, and he raises about 30 lambs in the foothills every year. Our lamb for this year is almost here. But I love the lamb shanks with the red blend, and that you can do a combination of interesting herby stuff with it. I mean, mint and rosemary and thyme and that kind of stuff cooked with the lamb shanks, and the red blend is really, really great to me.
I think I think of it as my slow cooked, short ribs.
Yeah.
Kind of cozy, wintry kind of dish.
Yeah. Can't go wrong with short ribs and the red either.
Yeah. Beef bourguignon kind of stuff. I think that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the steak I just gave mine away.
Yeah.
What'd you do with the calf?
There you go, with the calf. So, I mean, a friend of mine who owned a restaurant in Vancouver, he's been a long time restaurateur, but this is probably 12 years ago now, but I was eating at his restaurant and he sat down and ate with me, and he ordered the 32 ounce ribeye for two. And ever since that day, I just want to cook rib steaks that way. So our local butcher shop, they'll just kind of cut them between the ribs, and they're humongous. Sometimes they're 3 inches thick, and it's halfway between a steak and a roast. But I like to cook it on a wood fire, and sort of it's got an element of smoke by the time I'm done. And there's another cookbook that I don't have here, but it's a Francis Mallman cookbook. He has a chimichurri recipe that's it's really fresh herbs, oregano and parsley and garlic and olive oil and vinegar and some water and salt and a little bit of pepper, and that you can put it on the steak as you're cooking it, or you can put it on the meat when you're done, and that with the cab is pretty darn good.
Yeah. I'm going to cheat and use Mike's Zero too, because he's now cooked it for us, and it's really, really tasty.
Okay. We have some agreement.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay. So let's flip it around and say,
but I had one more that I want to mention. So I now have a meal that I want to try with the cab that I came across, but in this, mustards, everybody who's been to Napa knows mustards. It's one of those, there are a lot of restaurants that come and go, but mustards is one. They've been a great partner to our wines over the years, and they've I love what they do, and they're sort of a icon around here. But in the mustards cookbook is a recipe for veal chops with roasted red bell pepper and black olive relish. And I am going to try this with the 2005 Cabernet, which I think will be really amazing. And I'll probably turn that into a pork chop instead of a veal chop. But I can't wait to try that.
How would you think that would go with the Merlot? I know that wasn't on our list, but.
I think it would be good with the Merlot.
I feel like there's some black olive kind of notes in the Merlot.
Yeah. Well, we'll try it with both.
All right.
And let you know in our first 2021 virtual tasting.
Yeah, subsequent. All right. So we talked about what we like to eat with these wines, but let's flip the question around. Since it is the holidays, do you have any favorite holiday dishes, and what are they, and what would you serve with them?
So I'm sort of back to prime rib, but Molly, my wife, cooks an amazing prime rib roast. Mm-hmm. I love turkey too, and I don't eat it very often, but I love turkey and all the stuff that goes with it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing, and crab is another thing here that, the Dungeness crab season starts about now. And, it's a fun holiday meal too.
Yeah. My favorite holiday meal is something called potato supreme. And I believe my grandmother pilfered the recipe from a Cracker Barrel. So this is why we only eat it once a year on Christmas morning, because, your cholesterol has to take the whole rest of the year to recover. But it's potatoes and sour cream and cheese and all this delicious stuff. And I think that could be great with the barrel fermented, or not that we make it, but a sparkling wine.
Yeah.
Right? Kind of kind of like the mac and cheese, kind of cuts the acidity. So, and that feels very festive. So I think that's what I would do. All right, we've got a couple questions here, and then we'll wrap it up. So the first is, what are the differences that we notice between the block 7 and 22 and the block 28 Zinfandel, and how does it change the pairing?
So I feel like I'm going to give you an answer, and I feel like there are some years where this answer is really accurate and some years where it's not. But block 28 at times is a very much more sort of structured wine. It tends to have darker fruit, and it tends to have this, you could call it anise, you could call it licorice, you could call it, almost like fennel, but it has this distinctive note to me. Block 7 and 22, and we, as we combine those two blocks because they're the same clone. That particular clone has a very red fruit personality to me. It's sort of, cherry and raspberry and, sometimes strawberry jam kinds of things. So, to generalize, a little bigger structure with the block 28 and darker fruit, and the 7 and 22, it's a little lighter, a little more red fruit. So a little lighter in tannins. Block 28's a little more structured. And some years that's very obvious, and other years it's less so.
Yeah, I think for me it's the tannic structure in some years that makes me think I want to pair it maybe more with like a slightly richer cut of meat than I would with the 7 and 22.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
This is a good one. So Bruce LaBelle, I know you've asked this before, had asked us to address this. Does any wine work well with artichokes? Does it matter what you dip it in?
So I think the dip is the key. And the other thing, so I don't know how to pick a good artichoke. Like you have to have a good artichoke. And I think with some fruits and vegetables, you sort of come up, it's artichoke roulette for me. I check them all out and I try to get a good one, and sometimes you do and sometimes you don't. But when it's a good artichoke, and I think, I like to dip it in mayo with a variety of things, as many people do, but with a little bit of lemon juice, and maybe for the reasons we talked about, a little lemon juice can make it work well with a variety of wines.
Yeah, and I think that, some of those slides that we went through and everything, those same concepts apply, not just food to wine, but food to food, right? And the other way around. I think one way to kind of take the pressure down a little bit when thinking about pairings is think about wine as you would another, ingredient, another food item. If you squeeze lemons over your oysters, like have an acidic wine that goes with it, like that kind of, it's just, treat it like you would a food. And I think the opposite is true. So I think, Bruce, you're totally right. Like having some kind of slightly fattier dip of some kind makes it work.
But I think, when you have a sort of a tough and more bitter artichoke, again, for the reasons we talked about, it's hard to make that bitterness go away with the wine. Yeah.
And I think the same kind of goes true for me with some of those cruciferous vegetables, which sometimes can.
It's a cruciferous vegetable.
Like the broccoli, the kales, so I think, you can just get the vegetables maybe, but, finding some way to like add. And again, this is where, we very rarely just eat. I mean, artichokes actually is something we do just eat, but I'm usually not having just a plate of broccoli.
Yeah. And we do, we're pretty artichoke lucky here. When they're harvesting artichokes 2 hours away and they get here the next day, I think they might be better than some of the artichokes you find further away from here.
Yeah. I also have a note here, and I should correct the record. My mom did give me plenty of cupcakes as a child, so I was not cupcake deprived, but like the fabulous mom she is, she.
My mom's watching too.
Yeah. Did you get a lot of cupcakes? Alice, weigh in here.
I don't think so.
But my mom made some beautiful cakes and cupcakes from scratch, but I was, I guess, felt spoiled and really wanted the like store-bought saccharine ones. And, but now I know she was right. Her homemade ones tasted much better. So don't worry. I was not cupcake deprived as a child.
Megan recovered just in time for Christmas.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. I'm on the good list. All right. Well, so I think, this is fun. This is a topic we could talk about for hours. And I'm actually starting to wonder if we should take. I'm seeing the chat box down there is like very full, and Angela is nodding vigorously. We've got a lot of ideas, so maybe we should do like a fans of Hendry cookbook or something like that, and compile everything for everybody. But I think you really kind of figure this stuff out. I would say we're very much still on that journey as well, just by eating and drinking a lot of things. So that's what we're going to go do tonight. Go have burgers.
Yeah. And then this has been a tough year for most of us. And, we're wrapping up the year here. And I think we should say a big thank you to you guys for your help and support for this year. It's made, it's made a big difference here, and we're gonna get through this. We got a ways to go, but I hope in a few months we'll all be able to sit down and taste and eat again in some of our favorite restaurants.
Yeah, and it'll make it that much sweeter. So
right.
Thank you, everyone, and happy holidays, and we'll see you in 2021.
Thank you.
Bye.